Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie. Hello and welcome to The Money Factor. I'm Richard Naylor, your host. Today's topic is financial governance of nonprofits, and we're taking a board perspective. Our guests are Frank Venezia and Kevin O'Leary. They're both CPAs and directors at Marvin and Company. I'm really happy to have them here. I've been involved with a number of nonprofits. I've heard of a number of problems, both in the paper and with some of the ones I've worked with, so I know how important this is.
It's a really important topic for board members to understand the finances of a not-for-profit organization. They aren't really complicated, but you can get yourself into trouble if you allow the individuals who are writing checks, perhaps taking in the money, too much liberty, if you will, with the money and not having important internal controls in place. And so we thought it was a good idea to have a board perspective seminar on some of the basic things that you can look at with a not-for-profit organization, give them a primer in accounting, and help them understand where the pitfalls are, where the trouble is, and where they should focus their efforts. Knowing that they're volunteers, it takes some time, but if you focus your efforts, you really can do a good job in monitoring what's going on in the not-for-profit organization.
That's good to hear, because it could seem a little overwhelming, I think, to some volunteers who step in and realize, you mean I have to be careful that they're not going to do something illegal or wrong?
And that's a good point. Many people, being the volunteers, they get involved in the not-for-profit organization for social reasons, for assisting the organization, giving back to the community. But there's a lot of responsibility when you take on that role as a board member, and they have a fiduciary responsibility to monitor the finances of the organization and make sure that the money's expended appropriately. And we hear all the time, the newspaper every week has something in it about some not-for-profit organization, whether it be a small one or a large one, where there was some malfeasance and somebody got away with some money and ultimately they got caught. But if the right controls are in place, if the people on the board are doing the right things, you can mitigate that risk pretty easily.
Now, you're both with Marvin and Company.
That's correct.
And it sounds like you've dealt with nonprofits before recently, and yet you're doing a push to educate board members. How did that come about? And maybe tell us a little bit about Marvin and Company, why that happened.
Well, I'll go into the little bit about why we're doing this. Maybe, Kevin, you can talk a little bit about the Marvin and Company situation. But we work with a lot of not-for-profit organizations. We are board members of not-for-profit organizations, as well as we have not-for-profits as clients. And we see a lot of the issues firsthand at not-for-profit organizations. I've been involved in educating people about not-for-profits as well as others. I'm a lecturer at SUNY Albany. I teach auditing there. I've got a background in not-for-profit accounting and management at the College of St. Rose, and I teach a class there. And we thought it was just a natural thing to do because there's this mystique, if you will, about not-for-profit organizations, and that the accounting is so complicated and difficult. And that's not true. That's not true. It's just like any other organization. It just has a little bit of a different flavor to it, and that's what we're trying to educate people about.
So tell us more about Marvin and Company.
Well, we're probably one of the older firms in the area. I mean, we date back to 1923 down in Schenectady, but we've been dealing with nonprofits for a very, very, very long time. And we have...
Primarily to help them...
Well, we do a lot of audits of nonprofit financial statements. They're receiving some sort of governmental funding, Medicaid, Medicare, whatever it may be. And because of that funding, there's requirements, and one of those requirements tends to be you need an audit done. And that's where we usually come in, is there's an audit of a financial statement where we offer an opinion that everything is materially okay, in layman's terms.
In layman's terms.
And that has been a cornerstone of our practice for a very long time as nonprofits. We have very, very small nonprofit clients to the biggest in the area. But it's funny how it doesn't matter the size. The issues are usually the same. There might be an extra comma, there might be a couple more digits, but at the same time, there's usually some sort of control issue that was not there, or a control that wasn't in place and something happened, or there's an accounting issue and Jane is turning the books over to John, and Jane teaches John how to do it, so the accounting issue kind of continues. And because they're all volunteer organizations, I think that the best way that we can give back as a firm is to do a workshop like this, to get professionals in a room to talk about just the things we see on an average basis, and offer some advice as to how to fix it going forward. Because some of these nonprofits have been in this area for a long time.
That's
so
right.
The American Red Cross, for example,
Exactly.
would be very
Yep.
old.
Sure.
A naive question, and I think you kind of answered part of it, but I just want to formalize it so we cover different areas. What are the reasons why you help people with the financial part for nonprofits and boards?
Well, it's part of giving back to the community, and we really, as a firm, do a lot of that.
I meant in terms of what needs are...
What needs are out there? Well, most people don't understand internal control. Most people don't understand the accounting that's needed in a not-for-profit organization. And when you get volunteers who participate at the board level, they are sometimes not well equipped to monitor what's going on in the not-for-profit organization. You've got management and you've got the board of directors. The board of directors is responsible for the overall operation of the not-for-profit organization. They hire the executive director, they evaluate the executive director, and then the executive director hires fiscal management to deal with the revenue coming in, the expenses going out. The board has to monitor that. They have to oversee that and provide a level of scrutiny, if you will, to the organization, and sometimes they're ill-equipped. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they get involved for the right reasons. They want to give back to the community, and they are volunteers, but they are not always well-equipped to be able to deal with it.
So it's generally the chief executive who hires the auditors?
Well,
so what kind of relationship then does the board have with the auditors?
Well, that's a good question.
Because if you're selecting the auditor and somebody else is second-hand.
Most of the, well, we're not selecting the auditor, but the board usually has either a finance committee or an audit committee who is responsible for the selection of the outside auditor. As Kevin said, many organizations have to have annual financial audits.
And are those federally funded ones generally, or?
It could be all across the board.
Okay.
Sometimes there's federal funding involved, sometimes there's state funding involved, sometimes there's no outside governmental funding involved, but it's just a good practice for the not-for-profit organization to have an annual audit.
Okay.
The audit looks at the internal control, it audits the financial statements, it provides the board, those who are responsible for governance of the organization, with a level of assurance that, okay, fiscally things are being dealt with appropriately. Mm-hmm. But there are other not-for-profit organizations, smaller ones perhaps, that don't have any audits performed. And typically what happens is that the board of directors has either a finance committee or an audit committee, and they're the ones who are charged with the responsibility of engaging an external auditor to provide audit services to that organization.
Okay.
That's how that typically works. Now, that's changed radically probably in the last 7 to 10 years, where in many cases before it was management who was engaging the auditors, and the relationship was not between the auditor and the board, it was with management. But that was problematic. Management is the one that we're evaluating as far as the fiscal operations are concerned, and we need to report to an outside entity or an independent entity, which is typically either the board of directors, the finance committee, or an audit committee.
In any case, whoever initiated the audit, I assume that the board would also generally go over the reports.
Absolutely. Yeah. We do presentations all the time, the results, and it's interesting because I try to make sure that the board understands these are their financial statements, they're not mine. And my part is the report, where we report on those financial statements, and basically two things: are they materially correct and in conformity with what are known as generally accepted accounting principles? But the board is intimately involved in that presentation. They ask a lot of good questions, and part of our education starts right there, because we're educating those board members on an individual client-by-client basis to have a better understanding of what our role is and what their role is as far as the not-for-profit is concerned.
It's hard to say how any given nonprofit is going to attract new board members and what they need, because I suppose the executive director and some of the employees are really so focused on the job that they're supposed to be doing that they would hate to spend too many resources on things like audits. So when you're looking at getting a new board member, do you ever recommend that somebody on the board ought to have some financial experience?
Well, I think you can answer that one.
I think that the nonprofits that have, let's say, done better in the last few years financially have a diverse board. I think they have attorneys on their board, they have accountants on their board. If there's a unique issue that their organization is faced with, they have a person who might be an expert in that area on their board. I think the nonprofits who really have boards just made up of people who want to give back and
in a specific area,
or their kids may be in a program, or it's the hockey team, or whatever it may be. I think when you just have boards that are made up of people who want to give back, that's where you get into, they don't have the professionals or people who can sit around that table and maybe translate what a Frank Venezia is saying to them in layman's terms so that they understand it more on a month-to-month basis when they have their monthly meetings. Some of our nonprofit clients, we may only be in front of the whole board 1-2 times a year, so it's really hard to get that message across. So if you don't have that additional person on your home team, let's say.
Because month by month.
And month by month, especially if something unique happens during the year, if there's a law change, or if you have a board member or 2 board members that miss that annual meeting, it might be a year later that they actually get another refresher in the financial statement kind of lingo. So to have someone on your board that can understand that and translate that for you is very beneficial. So I think that the more diverse your board is, the better off your organization is, for sure.
Okay. Do you find that boards from different types of, whether it's a profit company or a not-for-profit company, are things so different that if you came in from a profit perspective, you would have still a lot to learn about nonprofits?
Well, that's an interesting question. I try to get my not-for-profit clients and my not-for-profit boards that I serve on to understand that just because you're a not-for-profit organization doesn't mean that you're not supposed to make a profit. Mm-hmm. Now, for-profit entities typically in our practice are owned by 1 or 2 stockholders, and so they control the organization. They don't have the same issues, if you will, that a not-for-profit has. A not-for-profit has no ownership, and it's run by this volunteer group of people, and the profits, if there are profits, and there should be profits in a not-for-profit, are supposed to go back into program services and provide additional services, expand services, and so on and so forth. And many organizations think, well, we're not-for-profit, so we should lose money. Mm-hmm. Well, you can only go for so long losing money before you run out. And you're stuck with either have cash reserves, you got to borrow money from the bank. So I try to get my not-for-profits to understand that you're a for-profit entity. You just happen to be exempt from paying taxes on that income. And it doesn't inure to any one group. It's the organization's money. But I want all my not-for-profits to make money.
I want to go into that a little more, because I think my first reaction is, well, profit means that somebody takes something home.
Yeah.
Well, in this case, taking something home is probably not what you want.
Right. How
do you look at profit in this case? When you're doing your bookkeeping, your accounting, what do you call that? Is it? I mean, to me, if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, you're spending everything. But how's the difference of the money that's called a profit used as opposed to something that's just overhead?
Well, in a not-for-profit organization, we typically call it the excess of revenue over expenses, okay? In a for-profit entity, we would call it net income. in a not-for-profit organization, they are supposed to monitor the revenue streams, control the expenses, and hopefully make some level of excess of revenue over expenses. That money goes back into program operations in most cases. It goes to pay administrative costs. And we look at not-for-profit organizations both from an internal when we're doing the audits as well as external when we're serving on boards and so on to look at what we would call the administrative burden. How much of what the not-for-profit spends goes into program services as compared to an administration cost for the organization. And we have a general rule of thumb that around 90%, if you can get it higher, that's great, but around 90% should be going back into program operations, and only about 10% of the dollars expended should be related to administration. Now that can vary widely depending on the size of the organization. Larger organizations can reach economies of scale. They can get down to maybe 92% going to programs. Smaller not-for-profit organizations might dip down into the 80% range going into program operations.
Okay. Looking at it that way, it sounds much easier to understand what you mean by a profit. A profit is really the ability to do what you're there for.
In a not-for-profit, absolutely, without a doubt. In a for-profit entity, it's what the owners put in their pockets for the risk that they take for running the organization and taking those risks.
The flip side of that, though, is, and I think this is where the benefit of having a diverse board comes into play, is when a nonprofit, in a for-profit entity, when times are tough, you hear about layoffs and you hear about going through expenses and budgets and really starting to trim the fat out as much as they can. In a lot of not-for-profits, I feel like the old school of thought is let's try and keep as many people as we can because they've given so much to the agency and there's a much more warmer feeling there. And that's where people get into trouble. In our nonprofits, the largest expense by far is salary and benefits related to, just like in any for-profit. But it seems like in the for-profit world, they're a lot more adept to cutting out where they can and where they need to survive, whereas in the nonprofit, there's almost a thought process sometimes that we hope to get more contributions, we hope to get more state money. I mean, just saying that makes me think you're never going to get more state money. There's just no more money to be had. We hope to get that big grant. So instead of we really need to get rid of 10% of our overhead, we really need to cut back on expenses. So if you have that diversification on your board, you might have people that lend to the fact that, hey, we really need to make some tougher decisions and look to cut places instead of just hope that big money comes in the door at some point.
So that sounds like we're keeping a really close eye on your mission and why you're there comes in, as opposed to just managing the money.
And I think that's important, and it goes to what Kevin's point was earlier. Not-for-profits, they are warmer than a for-profit. It's kind of cutthroat in the for-profit world, but in a not-for-profit, they're looking for, okay, I hope we'll do better, I hope we'll do better. But sometimes if you don't diversify the board, and as Kevin says, maybe you have a relative in a program, when it comes to cutting that program, well, you've got a vested interest in not cutting that program, and it may be absorbing a lot of cost, a lot of money in this not-for-profit, and that's the right decision. If you can bring in objective people by diversifying that board, they can make sure that they understand, no, we really have to cut this program, cut it down, close it down. Yes, there's going to be issues related to that, but it's the right thing to do for the organization.
Okay. Let's look at some specific problems that you've seen in different boards you've looked at. Where do people often make a mistake?
The biggest mistake that organizations make is they engage a treasurer or a chief financial officer, and they give that person unlimited power and access to the fiscal operations. We've seen it where that without controls, chief financial officers, bookkeepers, it doesn't matter. The chief person in the organization who handles the finances has diverted money coming in, and in some cases could write checks on the not-for-profit's checkbook and pay their own personal expenses or write checks to themselves. And so one of the things that I advocate for is getting the not-for-profit board involved in overseeing what's going on from the fiscal perspective. One of the things that I advocate always is someone independent needs to open the bank statement when it comes in the mail.
Now, that is a very concrete thing.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing that I tell them is, this costs you no money at all. You need to open the bank statement. You need to review the types of disbursements that are going out of the organization. You need to look at the revenue streams and make sure it all makes sense to you. Now, it takes some time, it takes some effort, and they need to be appropriately trained, but it costs them nothing. And this is one of the best ways to mitigate the risk that a chief financial officer, a bookkeeper, whatever they're called, is writing checks out of the organization to pay their own personal expenses.
Right. And your point earlier is that you don't really have to have an accounting background at all to do that. You need someone who understands the agency so that when flipping through and the payor is someone who doesn't make sense, they know to question that.
That's right.
It has nothing to do with debits and credits. It has nothing to do with accounting. It just has to do with opening an unopened statement and going through check by check to make sure that you understand why that's being paid. Why is there two Time Warner bills? Why is there a Home Depot check? Why is there whatever it may be? Oh, we did do an improvement in there, that makes sense. But it's just someone who understands the operations enough, though, so that they can ask those questions. But to Frank's point, you have these same issues on the for-profit side. And the easy way to say it is that trust is not an internal control.
Right.
People, they trust these people. Beth has been with us for 40 years. She would never do that. Well, the reason why you don't know is because she's been doing it every month for the last 40 years.
Yeah, right.
So, and that's why she has the house in the middle, and a resort that the owner doesn't have a house in. So, I mean, you just see it, and it's not a for-profit issue. It's not a not-for-profit issue. It's just a lack of control issue. And
I think we've seen gambling issues.
Oh, without a doubt.
Like that.
Oh,
absolutely.
without a doubt. And especially when the economy's bad, and right, the economy's bad, and there's opportunity there. We say it all the time.
Yep.
When the economy's bad, and there's always opportunity. Someone's going to do something, whether it's just one check or whatever it may be. It'll be there.
You know what I really like about that idea is that I've been involved with the libraries and nonprofits also, and one thing that you don't want to do is slow everything down and make it difficult to do your job. But this is all post-transaction. So you're looking at what happened. You're not saying, okay, we're going to have 6 people come in and look at the order before you place it.
And to that point, many times I meet with the board of directors and they say, well, we review every disbursement that goes out of the organization. I say, well, how about the ones that the bookkeeper doesn't show you? How do you know that you're looking at every disbursement? And Kevin's, well, she wouldn't do that. No. Trust is not a control. It's not about the person, it's about the system, and we advocate for a strong system of internal control over cash receipts and cash disbursements for just this reason, because this is how it happens. And it's as simple as looking at that bank statement and what went out of the place, what came into the place. It's like you would do on your own personal bank statement when it comes in the mail. You open it up, right? You open it up, and what do? You look at it and you see, are these things reasonable to me, or is there a bogus check in there somehow, some way that is being paid out of my account?
Something on my charge,
or on your charge. It's the exact same thing. So it's not a hard sell to most boards. It's just getting them into the practice of doing it.
Now, could there be some other outlet, if I could use that word, for money? You think you've got it all closed down with the checkbook. Is that it?
No. There's wire transfers. We have to be cognizant of how the money comes into the organization, how the money can go out of the organization, because you don't see a lot of evidence related to the wire transfer. So it's looking at, and typically what you're going to see is on that bank statement, you're going to see wire transfers going out of the organization. It's following up, as Kevin says, show me the documentation. As auditors, one of the 2 words we like to say once we hear something from an organization or a person in the organization, show me. Show me the documentation to support what you're saying. I'm not just going to take on face value what you're going to tell me. Show me the documentation. We're all about chasing evidence around.
Doesn't that mean?
No. It's called professional skepticism.
One of the problems, though, with that is that you may have a new board member and someone you've brought on to your board because of their credentials, and the rest of the board is made up of people who've been there for 10, 20 years, and your CFO has been there for 10, 20 years. And all of a sudden you have a new board member asking these questions. It would be interesting to see where that that questioning would lead. You know, you don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to be the new person, but at the same time, your fiduciary responsibility is that
Absolutely.
I'm on this board to make sure that this organization is running the way it should be run. And I just can't adhere to the fact that other people have been letting this go and not asking for that secondary documentation that says, oh, you have that other board member's signature on that, so I'm okay with that. Someone else has reviewed this.
So speak up.
Exactly. And that's important for board members. Don't just sit there. I mean, yeah, okay, the first, second, third meeting, maybe you sit there to get the lay of the land, but after that, it's your responsibility to speak up and talk about and ask questions, probing questions, and don't let go until you understand completely and you're satisfied.
Now, is there a need for board insurance? Corollary to that is, can the board be sued for some of these problems? Can creditors come back to the board and say, the person just gambled away all the money, but I'm taking you to court?
Well, we can't give you legal advice, but there have been situations where in a not-for-profit organization, the payroll taxes were not paid on employee compensation, and the IRS decided to interview the board members to find out, what was it that you knew? There's also directors and officers liability insurance that we recommend highly for all boards to have to protect them from situations where they might get sued as a board of directors for some malfeasance. But I wouldn't expect them to be personally liable unless they were, how do I want to say it, negligent, grossly negligent in the carrying out of their fiduciary responsibility as a board.
So is it possible that there are some responsibilities, some behaviors that are expected of a board member?
Oh, absolutely.
And that by not performing those, somebody could come and say, well, you totally are responsible here because you did nothing here.
Absolutely, without a doubt. And we read about that all the time. We read about not-for-profit organizations where someone has gotten away with some money and they go back to the board and find out, well, you had one board meeting in the year, and how could you monitor what was going on in this not-for-profit? That's a grossly negligent situation.
Okay, so it's possible.
Oh, yeah.
Did you mention a committee or some kind of an audit committee before?
Yeah. Well, let me say this. Many organizations in the state of New York, governmental entities, have formed audit committees. Part of the school district reform plan was every school district has to have an audit committee which interfaces with the external auditor. They hire the auditor, they fire the auditor, they are reported to by the auditor. An audit committee is separate from the board, okay, but it may be made up of one or two board members, and many times...
And that includes then company or organizational people
No,
as well?
it would totally external.
Okay.
Totally external. You may pull in one or two other people to sit on the audit committee who have a financial background, an audit background. I sit on an audit committee for a large not-for-profit organization, and they have 3 other members on the audit committee who have limited fiscal background, and I advise them and help them interface with the external auditor. I review the financial statements after they've been audited. I review a lot of their tax filings, but I am their financial expert. And that's the hope when you have an audit committee, is that you'll be able to draw in a financial expert to deal with some of the questions that Kevin has brought up here. Well, when someone says our internal control needs to change because of this, well, you need somebody who understands internal control to be able to bounce that off of and say, does that make sense? Should we be doing that? Or should we be hiring a person to fill in that position? Because in today's environment, many organizations have lost employees through attrition and have not replaced them. Well, that makes the internal control structure change, where you have incompatible functions perhaps vested in one or two people, and you need someone who knows and understands internal control to assist the board in making those decisions.
It seems like that also implies something that I was concerned about in my previous remark about being able to do this without making it difficult for the organization to do its job. And so you're trying to balance and come up with the most effective system. Mm-hmm. So could you talk about the systematic aspect of this a little more?
Well, we look at, and as auditors, we look at a lot of systems that go on in the organization. And as I said, sometimes there are employees with incompatible functions, and we have what we call sometimes downstream controls. Well, okay, rather than hire another employee internally, let's do something after the fact, similar to reviewing the bank statement. Let's do something after the fact that mitigates that incompatible
Instead
function.
of having two treasurers that are doing the same thing.
Exactly. And that's what we're trained in. That's what we do for a living, and we help organizations do that kind of thing.
Okay.
We're all about the cost effectiveness, because we understand if it was us, we would have a super system of internal control, but at what cost?
Right.
And you have to have the cost benefit analysis in mind when you're thinking about that.
And to that, on the other side of that is, from an audit standpoint, there's a perception that we're going in as auditors to find everything and anything that could be wrong. So you see these reports sometimes that talk about school districts, a good example, where they found someone used a credit card improperly for their own benefit for $1,000. It would take us a decade of auditing every single transaction, because you're talking about some of these school districts people don't realize are hundreds of millions of dollars in budget,
Right.
to find $1,000. That has no impact on a financial statement standpoint from our perspective. But we are there worried about the control aspect of that more. How did that person take the credit card and use that? Irregardless of the money situation, the financial situation. So we dig into the more of the controls, because if we try to test every transaction, we'd basically be employees of the school district at that point. So
Right.
some of the malfeasance that you hear about is not really, has really nothing to do with the audit versus what's going on, and the fact that people can get at things they really shouldn't be able to get to.
Well, they could have bought something that made sense for the school district and then taken it home. And
That's true.
so,
Right. Right.
You know, they bought it properly, it was paid for properly. Why is it on this guy's truck?
Right.
And so, as Kevin says, we're more about educating the board as far as what our responsibility as external auditors is, as well as when we are helping not-for-profit organizations from a board perspective. We're trying to get them to understand they have external auditors that they have hired. That's not their responsibility. This is your responsibility. You have a system of internal control to monitor those transactions of $1,000. That's not the external auditor's responsibility.
Okay.
That's the board's responsibility. And that's, again, part of the education, getting them to understand. They think the auditor's responsible for everything, and that's not true.
I'm just going to take a shot at this. Any red flags you've come across where you say, I wish they would have noticed that, I wish somebody would have said something?
Kevin brought one up earlier, but it's employees who don't take vacations. And you know, that happens. That's one of our red
Can't
flags.
afford to, right?
Well, either that, well,
I
they
mean,
can't
because they
afford
can't
to,
be
right,
away.
because they're perpetrating a fraud. And if someone did their job when they were
And open
away,
that bank statement.
then they might find what's going on. So that's a red flag to us. Another red flag is, and I mentioned it before, vesting responsibility for fiscal transactions in one person. That's just a huge red flag.
As a board member, you would look at that and say, no, no, no.
No. You can't do that. You have to have compensating controls in place.
And I think another one, and even the IRS is asking about this now, are related parties within the organization.
Yeah.
Especially in these not-for-profits, you'd be amazed how many brothers and sisters work at a not-for-profit, mothers and daughters and fathers and sons, whatever the correlation is. They might not work in the same department, so those relationships might not be that much of an issue.
Right.
But all of a sudden you have a father and a son working in a fiscal department, and you just wonder, wow, is that really set up the way it should be? And the board, they know it, but it may never have dawned on them to think about that from an internal control standpoint, that, wow, that person's reviewing that person's work or signing off on that work, and they're related. And the IRS has a question about your conflict of interest policy and what kind of policies have you established to mitigate those risks. But people are so in tune to the doing of action and in being there and doing it that they don't step back to say, you know what, that could be an issue for us down the road. So you think red flags, and they're easy for us to sit here and say, here's what we see. But when you're in there every single day, it's hard to realize a red flag sometimes.
And that's what the objective perspective that we bring to audits or to serving on boards can help that not-for-profit with is we've got this perspective that's totally objective, and we're not into the relationships or anything else. We want to just see it from a bird's eye view, if you will, and we can pick out some of those red flags right away. It's really quite unique sometimes.
You're going to have a workshop, but before I ask you about that, is there anything that you think you wish I would have asked you? Anything that strikes, well, you should have said.
I would only say that for board members that are out there, if you have an external audit being done, you almost want to ask your auditor for the management letter.
The management letter, sure.
And almost in a lot of audits, when we go in and like Frank said, we try to identify.
So that's the letter from the auditing.
At the end of our audit, we go into the field, we test all your controls, all those things, and areas of risk that we found. That part where we get to maybe identifying some red flags, we will issue a letter at the end of the engagement saying these are areas that we think you need to improve upon. During our test work, we found this, and here's an idea as to how to, like Frank said, give those bank statements to someone else to review. That would help mitigate that risk that we came across. Or during our audit, we came across the fact that whatever it may be, and I feel like your nonprofits. Maybe it's a great nonprofit. Maybe you have no issues, but it's hard to think that there is one out there that they couldn't offer one issue to you that says, you know what, during the next 12 months, why don't you work on this? And then next audit, we'll test it again to make sure that you're in compliance, or not compliance, but you've kind of adapted to where you need to be.
So you're assuming it's not a perfect system. You can do something better.
It almost never is.
Right.
Because a turnover is a perfect example. The way turnover happens, and with attrition and just people not being there, retirement, whatever it may be, you all of a sudden lose an employee that's been there for 25 years and you have a new person there. By nature, you almost lose the control, you know, and at the same time, you almost have the new advantage of being able to establish a better control sometimes, because you don't want to make him or her mad in their 24th year that, we want to do it a little different now all of a sudden. So let's wait till they go and then we'll make it better. So I think if you ask your auditors for that, for those representations and those comments, it's a really good advantage.
Might be a red flag if they don't offer it.
That's true too. But again, that's part of the audit committee's responsibility is to garner that information and be able to understand it using a financial expert who's schooled in this area and help translate that into changes for the not-for-profit organization.
What you said, I've got to throw one more thing at you.
Sure.
The executive of any organization wants to get on with business. Doesn't want to spend his life explaining everything and have people who don't live there and don't do this all the time and don't probably know as much about the situation as the board, getting involved in little details. So you talked about a balance. I guess, what kind of advice would you have for a board so that they can fully do their job and not have to answer to the charge later that, well, they were micromanaging?
Well, it is a balance, as you said. We try to get our boards to understand, and then there's a phrase I use all the time, it's called noses in and fingers out. You put your nose in it, you start to understand it, but you keep your fingers out, and that's my, I guess, micromanaging. You want to keep your fingers out. You're there to ask probing questions, get answers to those questions, but you are at a higher level, and it's the executive director and the other management people in the organization who are really responsible for carrying things out. Don't get involved in and don't go behind the back of the executive director or anybody else in the organization. You got to be up front and put your nose in it, understand it, but keep your fingers out.
That's kind of neat. Now, this workshop.
Yeah.
Tell us more about it. September 19th.
September 19th, from 5:30 to 7:30. It's an overview, if you will, because in 2 hours, how much can you do? But it's an overview.
We've spent 40 minutes.
I understand. It's an overview of financial management for not-for-profit organizations. Alan Krieger, who's got a firm called Krieger Solutions. He's been an executive director at 2 different not-for-profit organizations, and he's going to be a co-presenter with me. He's going to talk about more of the detailed, intricate things that go on in the not-for-profit organization, because he's been there, he's done that. I've never done that. And I'm going to talk about the higher level audit side of it, putting in internal controls, how to interface with the external auditor. It's going to be a 2-hour interactive session, and if people do come, they're going to have to work. They're not going to just sit there.
Sure they want to, though.
They're going to work.
Important.
There's going to be exercises, there's going to be reporting out, there's going to be a variety of different things that'll keep them engaged in the hopes that we are able to give them some basic knowledge. And it's not the only workshop that we're going to do. We're going to have to do more because there's a lot to learn, and this is just the skimming the surface.
And this thing may fill up before somebody can even
Yep.
get in. How does somebody reach you to say, I'd love to go, can I go?
Call Marvin and Company at 785-0134 and tell them you want to register for the September 19th workshop, and we'll take care of that.
That sounds good. We'll put that up on the screen and leave it up there for a little while so people can find you.
That'd be great.
We could go on and on. There's so many details in finance that I dare not get into the textbook, right? But a lot of good advice.
Thank you.
I want to thank you both for being on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. It was a good time.
And I want to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the show, that you tune in again next time, and that you have a great week. Take care. Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.